So this is the final panel of the day, and this is the panel we'll talk about the role of science and research in improving outcomes for children. We recognize that scientists have a very specific and limited role in all of this. Parents, teachers, educators, policymakers have huge roles in this, but we have to contribute what we can contribute. We also recognize that high-quality science moves at a glacier, painful, slow pace relative to the urgent needs of children. There are children in schools right now or approaching summer vacation, who need help right away. And parents care about that, teachers care about that, siblings and the communities. High-quality research moves shockingly slowly, and I apologize for that. And we know that. But on the other hand, the best of science is a dogged determination to discover the truth. And from the first two talks today, we've heard that we really need truths to guide choices in how we help teachers prepare, how we best help students reach their capacities in terms of various kinds of abilities and skills and focusing on reading. Science brought humans to the moon. Science brought penicillin to the ill. We want science to do whatever it can to have better reading outcomes for all children. And so in broad terms, we're going to ask two main questions. How can science that we already know be shared effectively with parents, students, and schools? Not blaming people, as we heard, there's not a blaming thing. It's that how can we communicate better so that we have shared vision, shared information that's helpful all around, of things we already know? And what things do we need to know as soon as possible to improve things for outcomes for all children? What do we already know, and what do we need to know? So I'm really thrilled with the panel that we have, and maybe I'll ask them to come up now. Can I do that? As I think you'll have the, as I think you'll have the, oh, nobody heard me at all. They were going like, when is he starting, right? All right, so, as I think you'll have the pleasure of hearing, these are amazing individuals with a real passion to improve outcomes for kids. So let me introduce from that end. Dr. Nadine Gaab is Associate Professor of Pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School and a faculty member at Harvard's Graduate School of Education. Her research focuses on auditory and language processing in the human brain and its applications for the development of typical and atypical language and literacy skills. Nadine, here's the personal nugget, was not only the first person in her family to earn a PhD, she was the first person in her family to graduate from high school. Dr. Tiffany Hogan is director of MGH Institute's Speech and Language Literacy Lab and a professor in the MGH Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders. Through her research, she explores new ways to improve diagnosis and treatment for children with dyslexia, developmental language disorders, and speech sound disorders. With 3 sons, a husband, and even a male dog, Tiffany is the only female in her household. I'll go here. Dr. Louisa Moats has been a teacher, psychologist, researcher, and author. She's currently founder and president of Moats Associates Consulting, where she supports the growth in teachers' knowledge of reading, writing, and language through publication, instruction, and advocacy. A highlight of her time living in Nashville was having a parent-teacher conference with Johnny Cash. And finally, in his role as professor at Harvard Graduate School of Education, Dr. James Kim studies the effectiveness of literary reforms and interventions in improving student outcomes. He also leads the Reads Lab at Harvard, which seeks to build knowledge to improve outcomes for low-income children and struggling readers at scale. James adopted his 3 children from Korea and loves to regularly run literacy experiments on them. So before we jump into our questions and discussion, and lots of time for you to raise issues that you care about and want to share with us, we do have one more poll everywhere question. What percentage of the 16 million children living under the poverty line has a book in the home?
That's a good question.
I wait about, 30 more seconds? Does that sound right? Okay. Those of you looking it up on Wikipedia, you're... So the answer is 33%. So let me move to questions and hear responses. I will encourage panelists, after each has responded to their question, to talk with each other and talk with you and get your questions and comments. Louisa, what exactly do you think is the difficulty for teachers to understand about teaching reading effectively?
Okay, can everyone hear me? I would like to go back to a remark in Dr. Seidenberg's address this morning that is really at the heart of the issue I'd like to talk about for a few minutes, and that is that print represents speech. Print is a representation of language. And if we understand that, then it would seem to be logical, if not proven, that teachers, in order to teach children how print represents speech, need themselves to understand language and the structure of language. There was a remark about that earlier from the audience this morning as well. And a question about, well, why don't we then ask teachers to study language? And I consider myself among the very fortunate that I got my doctorate at the Harvard Ed School, and Carol Chomsky at the time, this is eons ago, Carol Chomsky was on the faculty, and she required all of the master's and doctoral students to take her course in the called an Introduction to Language, and I credit her with really opening my eyes, because I had been a teacher and a this and a that for 10 years with a master's degree and did not understand myself, even though I had taught kids and used programs and worked in a neuropsych lab and so on, I did not understand how print represents speech, and I didn't understand about the structure of language. And it was the beginning of really the rest of my work. So now my work is about teaching teachers to understand language. And what I want all of you to know, if you're not out there working with teachers all the time, just how bad things are. We give tests all the time throughout professional development, before, during, and after. I've done research. I have at least a dozen colleagues who've done research, and all of it involves giving surveys of language knowledge to teachers to see, and these are licensed, experienced teachers who've been in the classroom and who are using instructional programs, and we ask them to do things like, how many phonemes are in this word? Sing. And I do this with any audience, and I get everything from 1 sound to 2 sounds to 3 sounds to 4 sounds, and sometimes even 5. And there's no agreement, and this is a simple 1-syllable word that's taught in kindergarten or 1st grade, and on the whole, there is no uniform understanding of the fact that there are 3 phonemes in the word sing, let alone the identity of the 3rd phoneme, and so on. So anyway, our results on just phoneme identification and analysis are really poor, but that's only the beginning of the story. You ask teachers how print works to represent morphemes, for example. There's almost no understanding. You ask teachers to define what a sentence is. We had a 20% correct response on a question about what is a sentence, and the favorite response was it has a capital and a period, not that it has a subject and a predicate. We have done, so it's not all just about phoneme awareness and phoneme grapheme correspondence and phonics. Phonics, as Mark said this morning, is only part of the story. The real story is that learning to read and write involves language knowledge, and a teacher who's capable of teaching this has to know how language works, how it's structured, and how it's learned. I've run into teachers who think that language is learned because it's wired into the brain, and if someone's a dialect speaker, it's because it was wired into them before they were born, not that they learned it from the adults around them. I mean, just profound misunderstandings. And then when we get to the other big area of comprehension, we find that teachers cannot tell us the difference between a narrative and an expository text. They cannot tell us the features of academic language. They cannot tell us out of 4 words which one is an adjective. And while, it's like anatomy for a physician. It's basic stuff, and yet we find when we go out there and we start teaching people about this that it's a total revelation, and that by and large, we have teachers saying, I am so glad you finally taught me why there's an E on the end of the word have, for example. They don't know any of these things, and the other thing we've learned about it is that the reason this is the case is that the structure of language is elusive. We're not wired up to analyze language. We're wired up to use language to communicate. So becoming consciously aware at the level you need to be aware in order to teach it explicitly requires professional study and professional know-how. And this is the sort of paradox about teaching reading. People think that because they can read, and because they went to school, that they should be able to just jump into the classroom and teach somebody else how to do it. It's a real paradox in our field that we don't honor the complexity. And I, at one time, said teaching reading is rocket science, and that's what I meant, is that these are concepts that we have to learn as a professional discipline. Right now, we are not expecting that of teachers in training. There's always too little time and too little money, and that, to me, is the heart of the issue and something we can and should do something about. Thank you.
Thank you. Nadine, can you tell us what is the dyslexia paradox and what are its implications for children and educators?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so currently we have a discrepancy between when we identify children having dyslexia or when we diagnose children with dyslexia, which is usually after a significant period of failure. So we have a wait to fail model. However, we also know from really a lot of different research labs that the optimal window for effective intervention is much earlier than the current window of diagnosis. So we usually diagnose children at the end of 2nd, beginning of 3rd grade, the earliest. And many, many children, especially children growing up in low CS families, children growing up with English as English language learners, are identified much, much later. So this is the paradox between when kids are identified and when there is the window for the most effective intervention. And so we need to move from a deficit model to a preventive model. We have this in medicine. I work at Boston Children's. We have this all the time. So we know that if you are diagnosed with, or someone identified you as having high cholesterol, you don't get a diagnosis of heart disease, but people want to know and people want to do something about it early on. So they may change your diet, they may prescribe you exercise, maybe some medication. So the idea is that you never develop heart disease. But this preventive model, we don't have much in education. We have a deficit model. We wait till we see the deficit and then we do something. So we really need more preventive efforts like early screening, and there's been a great effort, especially in Massachusetts by Decoding Dyslexia and others, to really push through laws and mandates that enable kids to be identified early, not diagnosed early. We want to identify them as being at risk so that we can do something right then so they will never develop problems with reading.
Thank you very much. Tiffany, you've been thinking about how research should fit with practical issues faced by schools in teaching reading. Can you tell us how you have worked to better bridge research and classroom teaching?
Okay. Yes. So I am a trained speech-language pathologist. So prior to working in the academy as a scientist, I was a clinician educator. So I practiced for several years, worked with school-age children, And then I became a scientist. And what I noticed almost immediately as a scientist is that there's a different currency for a scientist versus a clinician educator. So to continue to conduct science, we have to publish articles. And we have to publish these scientific articles in scientific journals. But as an educator and a clinician, you often don't have access to these articles because there's a paywall. And so you want to get the articles, but you don't have access to the articles. And so I've thought a lot about how do we bridge the gap between research and practice, but also thinking about practice to research. And there's one thing that I've definitely thought a lot about, and that is that we have to, as scientists, become uncomfortable. And we have to become uncomfortable because we have to go places, do things that we haven't been trained to do. So there's a few things that I've done to bridge this gap, but it's quite uncomfortable. I've had to learn new skills along the way. The first thing I've learned to do is to go where educators are. So educators are often on social media, whether it be Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and one thing that's very popular right now is podcasts, for instance. So listening to podcasts, getting information through that venue. So I had a few students that said, you should start a podcast. And of course, as a scientist, I thought, there's no way I don't have the skills to do that. But I became convinced when I started to look into podcasts and think about how can I convey or interact more directly with educators as a scientist. So not just sitting in the ivory tower, doing these studies, writing these research articles, but really thinking about how to communicate in a different way and how to communicate the science in a different way. So I started a podcast. It's been quite a learning curve where I talk to scientists and educators about the work they're doing and have started to get more feedback. So I have about 3,000 listeners on the first episode and gaining. So I'm getting feedback that people are seeing this as a way to really get access to research and try to think more about that access. The other thing I've done, again, that's made me very uncomfortable is to be more involved in Twitter and to be involved in Twitter chats. So you can get on and try to, chat it up. And my first one was, almost heart attack inducing. But I'm trying to get out there and, try to be more accessible and convey this information in a different way. And it's made me think more deeply about the science I'm doing and whether it matters in practice. And that brings me to the second skill that's also uncomfortable that I've tried to push myself to do more, and that is to listen to what educators have to say and to be in their environments. So I go to schools now, I go to classrooms, I talk to teachers and educators, and I really, really listen. I don't preach the science and say this is what has to be done, but what I do is listen to what are the needs, what are the barriers, what's happening in the classroom, and then how can I adapt my science to make it more applicable in the classroom. So really thinking about different venues to communicate and really having that two-way communication of listening to educators and just being more comfortable with being uncomfortable and learning some of these new skills is one of the things I've thought about to bridge the practice gap.
Thank you, Tiffany. Jimmy, your work at the Harvard Reads Lab focuses in part on identifying and scaling solutions for improving children's literacy through randomized field trials. Does one size fit all with these trials? In other words, why aren't we scaling up the most effective solutions at all schools nationwide? Or are there other factors we should be aware of when we're thinking about scaling up an intervention that has only been tested in a very specific environment?
So I just want to start by saying how much I admire Tiffany for getting on social media, because that is, you deserve, you have all my respect. I think what I want to do is, in thinking about this challenge of why we're not scaling up effective programs, make a distinction that Ron Heifetz, who's a scholar of leadership, makes when he talks about the difference between an adaptive challenge and a technical challenge. And my very brief answer to John's question is I think that scaling up effective literacy solutions is largely an adaptive challenge and it's not a technical challenge. And one of the classic mistakes that we make in leadership is when we confuse an adaptive challenge as primarily a technical challenge. So let me provide a little bit more context. I'm going to riff on something that Louisa said and John said. You guys notice how they both invoked rockets? That's because this is the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing.
Right.
And interestingly enough, 10 years ago, about 10 years ago, I think, Tiffany and I were both part of this. The United States Department of Education launched an initiative called Reading for Understanding. We're going to invest over $100 million in 6 project teams, over 120 social scientists, to help kids read for understanding, right? So this is a comprehension part of what Louisa talked about. And what's really interesting about Reading for Understanding is when they announced the initiative, US policymakers made an explicit parallel between helping all kids read for understanding, pre-K to 12th grade, and going to the moon. And here's what it said in the RFA. President Kennedy's goal to land an American on the moon with 10 years seemed almost unimaginable in 1961. Surely the goal of teaching our children how to read for understanding is as important to each child and to the nation as a whole as being the first country to reach the moon. The Institute believes that a tightly networked and coordinated group of social scientists can work together to accomplish the goal of rapidly increasing the nation's ability to teach children how to read for understanding. So when we think about why we're not scaling up effective solutions nationally, I'd make the argument that, I'm not going to say going to the moon is easier than reading for understanding, but I'd make the argument that sending a man to the moon is mostly a technical challenge. The problem and the challenge is clear. The solution is clear, and most of the implementation of the solution rests with experts at NASA. But when we think about helping all children in America from pre-K to 12th grade read for understanding, that is, read their content area science and history books with comprehension, that's an adaptive challenge because the reason why kids struggle with that, not always clear. The potential set of solutions is also not always clear. Is it a tier 1 content area intervention? Is it tier 2 small group instruction? Is it tier 3 intensive one-on-one tutoring? And in essence, I think we don't recognize that the challenge of helping all kids read proficiently by 3rd grade on the MCAS or read proficiently on the 4th grade NAEP is more of an adaptive challenge than a technical challenge. I am a good news guy. I don't like to talk about bad news. And so I want to end with, instead of the IES model of having a tightly networked and coordinated group of social scientists, I want to invoke the Tiffany Hogan model, where the bridge between research and classroom practice is a two-way street. And I'm a professor at Harvard, but I started my career as a 7th grade teacher, and I most strongly self-identify as a classroom teacher. And one of the models that I think has great promise in scaling successful solutions is an initiative at the University of Iowa. It's called the Iowa Center for Reading Research. It's a phenomenal center. It's focused on 3rd grade reading. But what they do is they emphasize what I call the 3 R's of reading research: relevance, rigor, and replicability. They ask the superintendents and the principals and the teachers in the state of Iowa, what are your challenges? What are the problems that you're facing? Then they convene those folks and they say, before we scale up, let's do a serious RCT of whether this works, for whom it works best, and under what conditions. And make sure the science is rigorous, and make sure that we can replicate these results. And if you think about that model, it's a great model for R&D, because imagine if there were a Harvard and MIT Center for Reading Research where our first goal was relevance, where we reached out to these amazing parents and teachers and principals and asked you guys, what are the concerns you have? What are the things that you need solutions for? And then we brought the best minds together to do rigorous science, and we thought about replication at scale. So in brief, I think that helping all kids read for understanding is largely an adaptive challenge. And we need to go to those folks at the front line and figure out what solutions they're desperately needing to address this adaptive challenge.
Thank you. So I'm just going to say a word or two about what we're doing here, if that's okay. And I can say this without giving away any private information about my autobiography. One of the hardest things is, so half of my life I spend working on mental health issues. And in that biomedical domain, randomized clinical trials, which have many issues actually, but are still a coin of the realm for deciding whether a treatment is safe and effective on behalf of patients seeking help, right? It's really hard to do, and Jimmy does some of the nicest work, and these are the best scientists in the field in many ways. It's really hard to do RCTs in educational environments. Is this fair? Because if you go to a school, they say, we're doing the best we can to teach reading. We're not going to put half our kids into your supposedly good program, which has not been proved yet. And we're not going to put randomly the other half of the kids into some other program because they have to learn to read. This is an urgent, immediate business to help every child read now. So, so going to schools in the midst of their educational mission and asking them to participate in a randomized clinical trial, although Jimmy manages to do it and Tiffany and so is a really hard ask in the reality of the educational environment. It's a really hard ask. It's harder than to perform biomedical RCTs, which are time limited by nature. So approach we've taken, and Joanna talked with you a little bit about Ola's work, and Jimmy's a fan of this too, are summer programs. We're kind of enthusiastic about that. Because in the summer, although it's very limited, it's not the real school year, you can combine science and education in a real way. And the way we're doing that, I'll just share one study very briefly that we're working on desperately at the moment in terms of getting everything done, is we went to the Cambridge public school system, and we said, here's what we'd like to do with you as a partner, that we would like to you to refer to us in your 12 schools. I think Joanna, did we go to all 12? Okay. The students in first and second grade who you think are most lagging in reading and could use some extra support. And the schools identified the children they cared about, listening to the schools, listening to the teachers. And we went into the schools and we screened them a little bit to make sure they were the kinds of children that we thought we could help, because some kinds of children have difficulties that were beyond the scope of the kind of intervention we could support. Then the next thing we did freaked everybody out. We said, we're going to randomly assign a third of the children to a math program, because you have to have a comparison group. Everybody who shows you pictures, this is all over their internet, of how their program works. They say, here's their kid in September, and we sold this program to the school system, and here's the kid in May, and look, the reading scores went up. As did their height, as did their ability to play sports, as does everything in almost any kind of school environment where children are growing that isn't a horrible environment. Is that fair? So you never know whether a program is really lifting a child if there's not a comparison group. You're always going to get, quote unquote, better across the school year. And so we said, a third of the children we're going to randomly assign, which we have, to a math program. Now, math is a good thing. We're MIT, get kids ready for STEM careers. Many children, not all, many children who struggle with reading struggle with math as well. It may not be actually a core math problem. It could be a lot of language in reading, in math, early math. But in any case, so it's a good experience for everybody, either reading support in small groups or math support. And then we're going to do extensive characterization of every child, both certainly behaviorally, and also we're doing brain imaging where parents let us do that. And most parents have, right? Although it's a really remarkable thing to talk to an average parent in a Cambridge school and say, we have to do brain imaging before and afterwards, right? It's a really exotic request. But with that, we can do both science and good, because everybody gets an educational support. We have comparison conditions. And we're hoping by working at this at the district level with partners across schools, we're really having a foot in the real education space. We know the summer's different, but we're not doing something that's very laboratory bound. We're really mixing it in with the schools, the teachers, and the district level. And so we try to find these sweet spots, so to speak, where the science can be excellent, and the support is meaningful on behalf of students in terms of education. And we're partnering with larger and larger educational entities beyond single schools. So this is how we're trying at MIT. And one of the things about this panel that's fantastic is, as you already have heard, all of them are superb thinkers, experimentalists, and very concerned that their work really affects the outcomes of children and makes their lives better. So you have really everything going in these, I got to choose this panel. This is, you heard that there's passion about both doing it right and doing it well on behalf of children. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions if there, yeah. Oh, we have to get a microphone, I apologize. And for those of you on that side, I've heard that we've neglected you a little bit, so there's extra pressure on you to come up with questions.
This is not so much a question as my thoughts sort of come together through this day, and thank you for bringing this topic here. I'm an educator, and I'm also privileged to be a teacher educator. And so I know firsthand how difficult it is to change teacher practice and all the things that Natalie said earlier. So I'll just give you some of the things that perhaps have worked for me and sort of inspire other people to do similar things. And I know my work is not done, but I'll just tell you some of the things. So going on from what Dr. Moats said, I'm here today with a colleague who is a speech and language pathologist, and I think that is an absolutely wonderful partnership to have, because when you work with a speech and language pathologist, you really get that deep understanding of language. So thank you, Susanna, for coming with me and partnering with me in this. So I encourage more people sort of to go that route, and I know that will make Tiffany happy too. And another thing that I've noticed is that I'm very glad, Tiffany, that you've gone down that social media P road, and I'm glad it's podcasts and not Pinterest. Because honestly, being out in the world with teacher practitioners, I love Pinterest myself for decorating my house, but I really find that, unfortunately, a lot of the teacher strategies that are out there to teach reading are pulled from Pinterest and not from the science. So, that is my message to also teachers too, is that the science can really inform rather than Pinterest. So.
Hi. So recently, I'm sure you've heard, I know PBS had a spotlight, a little segment on dyslexia. And in rebuttal, a letter was written to PBS. I'm sure you've seen it.
Yes.
And it was signed by dozens of professors from very highly respected universities and researchers. My question is, how do they have it so wrong? How is the misinformation spread by these, these are respected places. So how do they not know, or how, does that make sense?
Okay, I'll jump into the muck because I have nothing to lose. Nobody's going to fire me. I might get bad messages over the email. When I looked at that list, first of all, there were a lot of emeritus professors who, to me, represent the old guard, sort of pre-scientific thinking about reading. I also saw very few names of researchers, people who are grounded in scientific methodology and who really understand who would have read Mark Seidenberg's book and understood it, for example, which I think is the best synthesis out there right now about the science of reading, the laboratory techniques, the field techniques, and the convergence of different scientific disciplines on these issues of how we learn to read and what we need to do to teach kids how to do it, those who have to be taught. There were a couple of shocking names on that list to me, and I wondered sort of why. But for the most part, I would say about 55 people were those who have always kind of advocated for what I would characterize as whole language views about how we learn to read. And they represent to me that other world in schools of education that are so separate from science. And I think about this all the time, and I realize that I myself was not trained as a scientist per se, and the only reason I have an appreciation and try to translate it is that by accident I got pulled into it by Reed Lyon, who is the NICHD director, and who kept saying, you ought to meet these people who are doing the real work. And then when I got into one of these grants and I worked with people like Jack Fletcher and Dave Francis and Barbara Foreman, it was a whole new world. And I could have gone on in my education thinking for a long time, not even being aware that all that existed because of the separateness of journals, the separateness of conferences, the separateness of collegial meetings and all that we touched on this morning. It's a really big issue, and thank you for bringing that up.
I'd like to address it as well. Just following what Louisa said, I completely agree. I just want to add to it. So as a speech language pathologist, I've come to think about reading through language and thinking about language comprehension. And there's really these two primary processes involved in reading comprehension, or understanding what you read, and that's the word reading part, the decoding that involves phonics, turning the letters into production. But then there's the understanding part. And I think really what's happened that's been the big problem, and really what drove the reading wars, or the whole language versus phonics, is that the idea that language, or the comprehension aspect of language, could teach word reading. Language is important, but it doesn't teach word reading. And so having these two kind of components that Mark touched on, they're two big components, and Natalie's highlighting this knowledge part. It's very critically important to comprehension, is that you need both of those components, and they feed each other, but that doesn't mean that you don't need systematic phonics. And I think what's tricky is that there was a reason why there was a backlash to phonics, and that was because if you teach the word reading and not the comprehension and the knowledge, then children are going to be able to read words but not understand what they read. But it has to have both of those parts. So a lot of those professors have really been thinking about comprehension and trying to understand comprehension, but they haven't thought about how the science of teaching word reading. And they're two different areas that need to come together, and they unfortunately haven't.
Yes, hi. I was involved in Reading First as a literacy coach, a regional literacy coach. And it was very frustrating trying to get the science of reading into the schools. And I think one of the reasons it was so difficult was because it seemed punitive, and that only low SES school districts were able to apply for the grant. Yet there are many districts, wealthy districts out there, where they're doing the same thing for many, many years, yet they don't feel a need to change. And I'd like to know, is it possible when a new initiative comes out that maybe it could be other districts that apply other than the ones that are low performing, so that the message really is that everyone needs to get on board with science?
Well, we need a federal initiative of a few $billion, and I don't think that's happening right now. But it's that point well taken.
I think that Reading First targeting high poverty schools is a function of Title I. So it's just Title I of the Elementary Secondary Education Act, and President Johnson, who was our only president who graduated from a teacher ed institute, Southwest Texas State at San Marcos, believed that education was the key to social mobility. And so it's just a function of what the law is designed to do to support opportunities in disadvantaged communities. But I would say, again, I'm a good news guy. I get tired of bad news. I think a very important bit of good news for American education and American society is the fact that even with the reauthorization of the No Child Left Behind Act, in the sense that all this test-based accountability had severe unintended negative consequences, one thing that improved from NCLB to the Every Student Succeeds Act is we have evidence tiers now. So states are incentivized to think about whether this program, policy, or intervention has strong evidence. And strong evidence means that you've got one good randomized controlled trial. If it's moderate, it's a quasi-experiment. If it's weaker or lower, it's a correlational study with controls for selection bias. And if it's the weakest, it's just a theoretical rationale. Think about what that does for American education. Just to introduce that language of Campbell and Stanley and threats of internal validity into the decisions we make. That wasn't the case 15, 20 years ago. And that is the rule that now applies to all districts. And I think that's a positive sign.
And to that point, however,
Yep.
the Tier 1 instruction in districts, at least across Long Island, really are not doing evidence-based Tier 1 instruction. So they think what they're doing is fine because their scores show that their schools are outstanding. And that's what the newspapers publish. So they have no reason to change.
Right.
Yet I work with lots of those students privately because those parents can afford to pay for it. And it's just wrong. And I really do think that we need to start looking at this differently, where school districts should get on board with the science to help all children. And as of now, it seems like, well, it's just those children who need the help. And I think that's a major problem.
I think one good example could also be medicine again. So I think if I would ask all of you in the room if you would rather go to a surgeon for your surgery that you need to do, and the surgeon kept up with the science of doing surgery, or if you would pick a surgeon who is established but has not read a scientific paper in the last 30 years, what would you do? So I feel like if we go outside of education, we respect the science a lot more than inside of education. So maybe we need to really draw lines between different disciplines and say, why can't we really value the science of reading and scientific approaches, but we can in other disciplines like building a bridge or doing a heart surgery, for instance. I think we just need like a paradigm shift.
John, you challenge this side of the room, and they're coming on strong.
I don't know if we can get a microphone here as well. Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name's Nancy, and I'd like to thank all the researchers here in Massachusetts that have been very vocal and sharing directly with parents their knowledge. They reach out to schools, they do their research, as you can see, in the schools, but they've also been so respectful of the concerns of parents. And in that vein, when I hear the conversations like today, and we talk about higher education and meeting with the science, and we have some great academic conversations, which if people who know me know I love to follow this, it's a hobby now, or maybe a craziness, but it's encouraging. But what I see as the elephant in the room, or the missing piece of this conversation, which we've all danced around, is that teacher who comes to the classroom in the discovery model, now she has graduated and he needs to learn how to do this with 25 or 30 children who, as we can see, may have never received a book, might have language problems, might have all of this is facing them. They look out and they say, okay, what should I do? And they are really left with products that are sold. They're actually commercial products. And we have to start treating them like products, and some of them are not fit for their foreseeable and intended use. And we spend a lot of money as public citizens and tax dollars, and we use these products, or we buy more of these products when they don't work. Some of them were even mentioned today. And they might work for somebody somewhere, but that research has not trickled down to the lobbyists that show up at the state houses and in the local districts and court these dollars. And so which local legislator doesn't feel good about spending millions of dollars over 10 years on literacy, and then if you trace the money, it goes to a product that's not fit for its foreseeable intended use. So I think that I hope that will become part of the conversation, that it's great to bring all the science. I love it. But I think we also have to be better consumers from the top down and from the bottom up of what is in our classroom. And is it showing the science? Is it just a sticker? As they did in Arkansas, they stuck a sticker with the essential components of reading on a box and said, oh, this this meets the standard. And the Department of Ed there had to come out and say, no, it doesn't meet the standard and there is no research on it. We need more than a sticker that says the essential components of reading. We need to have better consumer protection, I guess. Thank you.
I think, yeah. I
Tiffany?
think that's a great point. And one thing I've encountered in working with schools is there's almost a bias towards buying a product versus using something free, which is kind of odd, right? You think like free, that would be great, but there's this bias to buy a big program, spend lots of money, and that makes you feel good, like it's science-based. But there needs to be more of like an FDA watchdog on these products because they don't have the science. And other countries, like Australia, for instance, are starting to do that. They're starting to have kind of a watchdog that says, this is not appropriate, this doesn't qualify. And I think we need more of that because right now we have a lot of educational malpractice going on in the schools, and it makes me sad when I hear about districts spending, $50,000, $100,000 on curriculum for children, and that curriculum is not science-based. It's shown not to be effective, and yet they're getting kind of a snow job in marketing and saying this is good, and it's not, and it's frustrating. And Jimmy mentioned that we were a part of this Reading for Understanding. We have products out there, lessons, curriculum that we developed through this government initiative. We have research support behind it, but it's free. And somehow when I go to districts and tell them about it, they say, oh, I don't know, it's free, it's online, I don't get it. And you know what I say now is I say it's prepaid. You paid it with your tax dollars. And they still, it's a struggle. So I think we need to think more systematically about the infrastructure for
Another
curriculum.
possibility would be to really include this in teacher training, right? To give them a class, how to identify a program and how do I know that it works and what are some of the key components I have to check off before I purchase it or recommend to my district purchasing it.
I wanted to add on to what Nadine just said. You can download this for free on Google. There's a wonderful paper by Keith Stanovich called How Teachers Can Use Scientifically Based Research to Improve Instruction. And his argument is everything we've just said. Teachers have to understand what is a RCT, what is a descriptive, and he talks all about the issues that we've surfaced. But he says something that's really important, and this is, again, going to my good news side, which is as much as we talk about the divide between ed schools and science and teachers and researchers, he actually argues that researchers and teachers have a shared epistemology, and that epistemology is a what works epistemology. Researchers and teachers want to figure out what works. They do different work, but that's a shared epistemology. And what he talks about in that article is he's trying to empower teachers to be able to consume critically the research that's out there so that we can make more informed decisions. So I think it's a wonderful, if we were to add it, Nadine, to a reading, that would be a great reading to add because it does exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think we also have this shared purpose. Like everyone in this room cares about children and helping children, even if we're coming from a different angle. Whether you're a researcher, teacher, parent, we have the same purpose. So I think it goes right back to what you said, Jimmy.
So I've been reminded that we're down to 5 minutes, and what do you think? 3 questions? Mark, Eric? Yeah.
What is the resistance to structured literacy, working Gillingham, the methodology? Why? What is it? Is it money? They don't have the money to train the teachers, the resources to support it? What is it? Because it does, it works at the Carroll School, trust me.
Can I?
No.
What's the resistance to these kinds of?
Resistance. Okay. Yeah, we deal with this all the time. And it's complicated, and a lot of the reasons have been cited already, but I would just want to maybe elaborate what I was saying earlier for a second, which is that the knowledge base required to understand what it's about is not part of what teachers generally have been taught. So,
Teach them. Why don't you go, you're in college,
so,
go to college to be a teacher. Why don't they teach them that?
all right, and then why don't they? Well, because the licensing programs, there are a lot of reasons why.
There's no reason why you put an education
Okay,
system.
wait a second.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to school.
All right. There are teacher credentialing commissions at the state level that establish criteria for accreditation. If they aren't holding the institutions to a certain standard of content, then it doesn't happen.
I just want to weigh in.
Yeah,
let's
let him do.
This is such a deep and broad question.
Yeah.
Let me make one
Yeah.
comment, if it's okay with the two of you, and then there's two hands that have been for a while, and we'll stop. I'm sorry, but there's a reception afterwards.
Yeah.
We share with the two of you the frustration.
It's
right?
the right question.
You know, and the
Yeah.
question that was asked about
Yeah.
why do luminaries in the field oppose this? Well, it's really hard. Imagine if, I'm going to be overly dramatic, imagine if for the vaccine debate, half of the top medical schools said, no vaccines, they're a bad idea, and half said, no, vaccines really save lives. Everybody be like, I don't know, and the doctors being trained go, I don't know, and this is where weirdly we are, which is so many people who are deemed to be expert, and there's such a long history, 100 years we heard, and so on, I think we heard, so many things have happened that it's just really hard to move that. It's like moving people's passion to improve the world in various ways. It's like global warming almost, but not maybe quite as daunting.
They're not quantifying the impact it has on the child.
I totally agree. I'll come back to this. I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. But change is hard. We heard it why.
I think summits like this.
Yeah, two other questions.
So I just wanted to echo you a little bit. I'm affiliated with Carroll School, and I also work closely with John. And I know what animates us is to scale some of the wonderful outcomes we see at Carroll. But what I want to say to the panelists is, a lot of what I hear with my Carroll hat on is millions of children deserve education that works for them. And if I just kind of take it to the highest level, virtually every child, actually, I'll say it this way. Of more than 2,000 children I've been involved in educating, every single one of them has learned how to read. And these are kids who would be tier 3 kids. So the state of the best practice is dyslexia. Language-based learning disabilities are not obstacles to achieving a very high level of literacy that allows children to read for understanding. The second thing I would say to the parents is, most of those children don't read as quickly and with as great ease as their typical peers, and it continues to be a struggle.
And last question from Mark, who started it today. Mark Seidenberg.
Nadine.
Sorry, my mistake. Okay.
So I'm going to introduce something that hasn't been mentioned yet, but I think is relevant. And I know this is on the science of reading, but there's another aspect to literacy, which is writing. And I don't want to make a long speech. I know we're almost at the end, but I know anecdotally that explicitly teaching kids to write can have a huge impact on their reading comprehension, and that's true for kids diagnosed with dyslexia, it's true for English language learners and other kids who struggle with reading comprehension. And, I just wonder why the scientific community and the education community hasn't focused more on writing, which I think, just as at a gut level common sense matter, writing is a more difficult thing to do than reading because it is expressive rather than receptive. And yet there is so much less attention being paid to writing, how to teach writing, and the interconnections between writing and reading comprehension. So I guess my question is, do you have an explanation for that? Or are any of you interested possibly in exploring that question?
Oh my. I can you kind of dumbfound us. I can say that our work focuses on both, and that we see them as different sides of the same coin, but writing is more difficult, involves more to it. But schools are definitely focused on writing, right? I mean, that's a huge focus for them, especially in their assessment. They do a lot of writing for assessment. And so I think writing is something that we definitely are interested in.
We build argumentative writing into our K-3 interventions as part of Reach Every Reader. And one of the things that's important about writing is it can be socially motivating for kids. If you think about argumentative writing, writing is a social technology to communicate a viewpoint, to make an argument, to defend that argument using textual evidence. So I'm with you on that. I think we want kids to write, to acquire domain knowledge. It's also important because, just as you said, it's a much more difficult cognitive process where kids have to organize a lot of different processes to communicate.
There's one more question, John, it looks like.
3 more questions.
More?
Okay. I'm going to be so short that if each of you promise to be short, we can zip through these last 3. Okay, I apologize. And there's a reception afterwards, and we more than want to hear your voices.
So I'm building off of what Nancy had said earlier about the packaged materials, but not only the packaged materials. I think also what this woman said about process. What I'm seeing is I teach a lot of children at a learning center. And children will come in who've had such horrible phonics instruction that one of my mentors said, I'd almost rather they did whole language because the kids are coming in with such bad phonics that they can't read because their sounds are that awful. So we focus a lot on the process, and I've found that at least might be the step that we need to give tools that work, and then the child can immediately be showing the tutor or teacher, oh, this doesn't work, because I think it's also true what we all want to see it work. It's just a thought.
Thank you. A brief question, and then Mark. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to comment and expand. So my daughter started at Carroll in 4th grade last year. Okay, she had, weaknesses with decoding. Still has weaknesses with decoding. However, she had no interest in expressive writing last year. But as the strength in her decoding skills and her fluency skills and her comprehension skills strengthened, her favorite thing this year is expressive writing. So I just think that for my child's particular case, it was focusing in on that huge weakness that was a difference in elementary school and the public school that became a disability because it wasn't addressed properly in the public school. So Carol inherited a bright child that learns differently, that developed a disability, great weakness. And what I mean by disability is that weakness was so weak, it disabled her. She could not read. And then with intensive instruction over 4th grade and continuing on now, they have a targeted cognitive intervention. She loves to write. That's gone in one year, one calendar year. So they're so intertwined, and it's obviously child specific, but I think they're directly correlated.
And thank you very much. And last from Mark.
I think these are a lot of difficult questions, and they require a lot more discussion at this level, and I hope there are further opportunities for it, because there are answers to the things that people have been asking. For example, why aren't certain teachers taught certain things? There's a history there. I wrote about it. Other people have written about it. You can find out how we got to where we are, and that's one of the steps towards getting out of it. Another thing I heard going by was somebody said malpractice. There are things that people on the education side have said and promoted that are so grossly false. I can't understand in any other field, that in other professions, they would indeed be guilty of malpractice. So, for example, denying the history of dyslexia research and claiming that it was invented by teachers and educators as an excuse for poor reading. Richard Allington, a big figure in whole language, et cetera, research says this repeatedly. It's a lie. How people, nonetheless a revered figure, very influential, talks directly to teacher groups, has an impact on them through his authority. Somehow, someone has to call folks out on this, or we're going to be stuck with what we have, which is, if you don't know the research, if you haven't gotten the training in basic cognitive science and basic linguistics, then you are dependent on authorities. And the trouble with authorities is that you may not know what their agenda is, and they aren't always reliable. And what we've had for decades is reliance on unreliable narrators of people's cognitive lives. The other thing I'd say is I'd really like to hear more success stories. You know, right now there's hand-to-hand combat. Every state, in individual school districts, debates are going on. Occasionally there are really good programs, or someone manages to put together the philanthropists and the state government and some interested, talented people, and they do something. I need to know more about those successes because they're really hard to find. If we're not going to have global change in the system overnight, being able to point to some successful programs and bring that to the attention of a wider audience, I think would be really important, and that's shared information we could have. The final thing about the materials is absolutely. So there's stakeholders we're leaving out here, including the publishers. I've been in school districts in desperately poor areas of the country where they have state-of-the-art electronics. I saw a projector with the words phonology and orthography on it, better projector than I have in my classroom, in a first grade classroom. And I saw stacks of reading materials because they got lots of reading materials. The teachers don't have the ability to use them. Finally, the other thing about the materials is, it seems to be one thing that came out of the reading wars was at least some of the big curricula that we've looked at have basically taken an everything in the kitchen sink approach. Basically, you have to include everything. You have to say that there's phonics, you have to say that there's this and that, you have to say that there's comprehension and so on. And the result is a teacher manual that's unusable, more activities that can be covered in a year given the amount of time that's available, and what happens? Teachers left to invent the curriculum on their own, which is not actually moving the ball forward. So, like I said, it's a big hole. And it's good that this is happening. There has to be something beyond reenacting these discussions over and over and over again in so many different places. There has to be some more concerted effort, and then some highlighting of programs that really do work so that we can model them for other people. Thanks.
Right. Thank you, Mark. So Mark has echoed Jimmy's optimism about things, and let me say that I know we face severe challenges that we've talked about here in different ways. I'm also pretty optimistic, like Jimmy, because we know a lot of stuff that could work, okay? For every complaint we have now, and they're serious, and they matter for children. We know a lot of things that could be better, and we have a vision of how to get there, I think, in various ways. And it won't be easy. It will require partnerships, you know, of the kind that across this room, parents, teachers, school leaders, scientists, you know, we'll all, policymakers, will all have to really work. But we think there's a path. I mean, sometimes you talk about a terrible disease and nobody knows how to treat it, right? We think we have a lot of information about how to make things much better for many children. But we do have the problem of how to enact it in the real world that we operate in. And so it's a substantial problem, but it's a better problem to have than one where you have no solution in mind and are crossing your fingers that research 10 years from now would give you a hint, okay? There's many problems we have like that. So I am very optimistic, and you know, let me end these final notes. First, I want to thank the phenomenal speakers all day long, a huge diversity. I want to thank a passionate, knowledgeable, caring audience for sharing so many viewpoints and experiences with all of us. I thank you so much. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.